You just want to start real quick by saying two things. One, let us know if there's any weird audio issues. That was one of the problems that I had on my end. Hopefully we're okay with that. And number two, want to give a thanks to Josh Pate for the shout out on his show. It was a last minute thing that we decided to do this live. So here we go. We're going to do plenty of victory laps in this episode, Josh, and we're probably going to talk a little bit about some things that we got wrong. And yes, we are going to touch on the CJ Stroud comments you made earlier in the year. We're going to touch on that maybe a little bit later. But first, let's talk about, just kind of recap and give Georgia their due and their win. Let's see, there's already some notes about Georgia winning in spite of Bennett. Come on, guys. Stetson Bennett, victory lap. Here we go. Josh, I said in the preview that Georgia was going to win, and mostly I couldn't get past the Alabama injuries, but also that if Georgia defense played a little bit better and didn't have Stetson Bennett pressing, we could see the comfortable Stetson Bennett who could direct that offense and be enough to win. And I think that proved true. Let's take this comment here, Josh. Did Georgia win a national championship this year in spite of Stetson Bennett, or was he a key contributor and proving us right that you can win? He is good enough to win a national championship, not Georgia is good enough to win in spite of him.
Yeah, as I was saying on the other feed, as we switched over to do our own technical snafu, but I think you learned a lot in the championship game about how important the pieces are around you to win a title. And something we said all year is that Stetson Bennett was the perfect quarterback for what Georgia wanted to do and the offense that they were trying to win. And I think people fairly and unfairly maligned him and his limitations without ever acknowledging the things that he's really good at. And it's like, what drives me nuts with the Stetson Bennett discussion is, well, you know, he doesn't really do much. He's not flashy when he's doing stuff. He's doing stuff everybody can do. No, that's not true. Stetson Bennett's efficiency, his ability to move around in the pocket and to get the ball out quickly, to read blitzes, is not something most quarterbacks can do, particularly in the current era when guys are 3 and out. This was a guy that really, really showed his ability to understand the offensive scheme that he was in. And Alabama in the national title game in particular was really limited to what they could do defensively because Bennett is so adept at attacking against the blitz. And people, you know, like clamor for Alabama to be more creative defensively. And if we just did something different, maybe we could stop them, and they're running it down our throat, et cetera, et cetera. And Bennett's constant threat to attack you if you overload, if you do things that you're not expecting, and the fact that he will consistently make passes, the fact that he'll get the ball out quickly, does so much for that offense. And so, no, he's not a massive vertical threat. And he hit some shots downfield when he needed to. He made some really good throws on those plays, but he's not going to bomb on you. But what he can do is when they set up those shots where his guys got a step or two because you're struggling with a run game, because you brought a safety on the blitz, he will reliably and effectively read that blitz. He will throw the ball, and it may have a little more air on it than you'd like, but he'll put it in the right spot for his guy to make a play and hit a deep play. And that does so much for keeping a defense honest, and that does a ton for letting them have a run game where, you know, Zamir White does 6.5 yards a carry, James Cook does 12.8 yards a carry, and that's how you win a football game.
And I'll say that there are legitimate criticisms of Stetson Bennett, and the people who have been levying criticisms at him were getting it wrong. So JT Daniels might have a better arm vertically, although the deep ball in the right corner of the end zone was a dime. My issue with Stetson Bennett is, and I think we've seen this enough now to know, Stetson Bennett, his biggest issue is not that he can't dig you out of a hole. I think athletically and how he understands the offense and sees the field, he can dig you out of a hole. I think more the problem with Stetson Bennett is that he presses when he's down. And that might get him in trouble combined with the height issues and some other stuff if he's wanting to go in the NFL. But in terms of like being a perfect match for this team that plays usually from a lead, especially with that defense, I think he was a perfect fit. And I think that it's clear by the end of the year, and we'll wrap this up because there's a whole lot to talk about. But I think it's clear by the end of the year that I forgot what I was going to say, so I won't say it. Two things before we get into one thing I do want to say is because people are going to ask, yes, I do take notes on this. There's no notes right now, but I will take notes on this. It's not just a prop, although it is kind of a safety blanket. And this is Knob Creek 12-year Ghost. If you're watching, thank you very much. Josh, so one question to this before we move on to the next one. I know you picked Alabama to win, and Alabama did do really well in that first game against Georgia. Obviously got the win, got the SEC hardware. Two things that I want you to touch on. One, is it kind of fitting that Georgia won, given they were really the best and most consistently dominant team throughout the year? And two, can you tell the people that were hating on Bryce Young in this game to maybe shut up a little bit?
Yeah. First, when we were doing our preview, both of us, despite how the first game went, both of us were pretty sure that this was going to be a dogfight. And I was looking at our predictions. You had Georgia 27-24. I had Bama 30-27. I don't feel bad with either one of those predictions, right? Alabama, it's a 2-score win, but the reality of the situation is Alabama is trying to drive to have a game-tying 8-point play at the end of regulation, and that would have been 26-26, which was right smack in line with where we thought it would be. And we often say it's a backdoor cover thing, right? Like, you can't tell if a guy intercepts the ball and he falls down on the way to the end zone, then your pick looks fantastic at 27-24. That's not something that's within the realm of prediction. But the reason we had that prediction, we said it over and over again, we both felt like Georgia was a significantly better overall team than Alabama. If you looked at just overall team ratings, you looked at like FEI or SP plus, whatever, Georgia is a better team. The problem, and the reason our model slightly favored Alabama, and a lot of other ones did too, is that the matchups decidedly favored Alabama, where one team or the other had an edge. And so there was always this balance of the better team with the worst matchups and how you evaluated that. It didn't strike me as in any way surprising that Georgia won. I think both of us, right? It was like almost, if not almost the entire year, then it was just the entire year we had Georgia as the best team in the country. There was one period where I thought Alabama might have been playing better football for a little bit, and then offensive line issues and offensive stagnation hit them. But beyond that, man, they were just the best team. And it was just solely a matter of whether someone could exploit their issues in the secondary enough to overcome that in the RPO era, where you can be a little susceptible. And in the first game that happened, and in the second game it didn't. And I think that's going to have to be a large part of our discussion later on, is why that happened and how that went. But in that vein, let me turn to your second point. And that's talking about Bryce Young and trying to hate on Bryce Young. I think anybody that looked at that with a critical eye would say that Bryce Young was almost single-handedly keeping Alabama in the game. So let me give you a handful of stats here, all right? Georgia ran 56 plays in the ball game. Bryce Young himself threw 57 passes. He threw more passes than Georgia ran plays. 35 of 57, 369 yards. The problem was his averages weren't great. 6.5 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 2 picks. Of course, 1 pick is in 2 minutes, which weird things happen. But they didn't get a lot out of the rest of the team. Brian Robinson had 22 carries, only 68 yards. It's only 3 yards per carry. They didn't really try to run without Robinson in the game, which I thought was an interesting aspect to it. Trey Sanders only got 2 carries. And one of Alabama's big problems is that when Brian Robinson a couple times got hot, but because of their injury situation, they did not have a second healthy tailback. And so when Robinson came out, Georgia knew they were going to throw. And that put tremendous pressure on Bryce Young, and it destroyed their ability to have a balanced offense. Really hurt them in the red zone a couple times where they were running the ball with balance. Robinson had to come out, and there was no real fear of Alabama continuing to have a balanced offense. So the pressure that was on Bryce Young was tremendous. The offensive line was doing him no favors. His receivers were all injured. Would you agree with this? If Alabama did not have a high level quarterback, and I think Stetson Bennett's a good quarterback, but if you flip the script, if you gave Georgia Bryce Young and you gave Alabama Stetson Bennett, I think this game's ending like 45-6, given the way the rosters were and the injury situation in Alabama. Bama would not have moved the ball without a high-level quarterback, and Georgia would have just destroyed Alabama due to the just lopsided nature of how time of possession went. I mean, would you agree with that statement?
I don't know if it would be that big of a blowout, but and also want to call out a lot of fans or a lot of Alabama fans were saying, you know, Bill O'Brien called a bad game. I thought he was throwing the kitchen sink at him, given his limitations, given the offensive injury situation. I thought he was calling a great job game for what he could. But to your point, just think about a couple of throws that were dropped. Like there were 2 touchdowns that were dropped that is basically, that's an 11-point swing because one led to a blocked field goal and the other one led to a field goal. And that's in that game, given people might look at the final score, but given how that situation was, if Alabama were able to score touchdowns on those 2 drives, that's a whole lot different pressure and game and situation for Georgia, as well. So I think that's it frustrates me to see people kind of denigrate what Bryce Young was doing just because they were seeing stats or they were seeing the score or whatever. And keep in mind, there's a lot of fans from a lot of teams that aren't had who were sitting at home who had the luxury of not playing Georgia's defense. And to see what Bryce Young has done in 2 games against Georgia's defense has really made a believer out of me, where middle of the year, I was not super high on Bryce Young. But the pass that Hall dropped on the sideline was under complete duress. It was an incredible NFL level throw. And that's what Alabama fans have to look forward to next year. Okay, Josh, we got to get to some super chats. And I know that one of them is going to lead us into an Ohio State discussion. So before that, CNKEP, I don't know how to pronounce that, if it's actually not an acronym. Did we learn anything this season from a game analysis perspective that will change how we do things next year? And Josh, this is a good question because a lot of people ask us, how are you going to tweak the model? How are you going to account for this or that? And I'll let you expand on this a little bit. But for me, I look at 2021 as a lot of maybe overswing, a pendulum swing in the other direction from 2020. We had a lot of super seniors and a lot of not great quarterback talent because, 2 years in a row or 3 years in a row, we had a lot of quarterbacks leaving the draft, and it affected what offenses could do. And for the first time in probably 20 years, college football, even 2007, if you go back and look, for the first time in forever, college football was not nearly as chalk heavy as it has been in the past. So for me, it's going to take more than 1 year. I'm going to view this year as a bit of an outlier. I'm going to keep my eye open. But for me, I have a feeling we're going to regress back to the mean in terms of chalk heaviness, and offenses are going to start to perform a little bit better as a whole. But Josh, maybe you can answer that question as well. Did you see anything this year that's going to make you change your approach to either the model or how we call these games when we're predicting them every week next year?
Well, so there are a couple things. I mean, I think the first thing is from Josh Pate's show. I learned apparently all things are possible through Academy Sports and Outdoors. They don't sponsor this channel, but I think his ability to spend everything into that is kind of incredible, and I'm going to give him a plug since he gave us a plug, so I appreciate it. But in reality, I think the biggest takeaway I had from the season was twofold. One, I think the transfer portal and the 6-year COVID year senior stuff had a real effect on the quality of defenses. I think defenses get a lot better with experience. And what we saw was a little closer to NFL style defense, right? There were a lot fewer busts. And the RPO puts a tremendous strain on players to not bust assignments. The teams that were elite, high level teams that had a lot of turnover from last year, Alabama and Ohio State, had a tremendous number of growing pains, right? And I think that was because they look like a normal defense. Whereas teams that a lot of them just returned everybody from last year across the board were a lot better than we have seen in the past. And I think that was really, really indicative of a number of factors. One factor is the transfer portal. And here's my big example. It's Ole Miss. Ole Miss's defense was not good and hadn't been good for years. And this year, with a combination of transfers and guys coming back, you watch that Baylor game, and a lot of people saw a massive disappointment because Ole Miss wasn't scoring a lot of points. Now, there was a lot going on there. I think that game probably does go a lot differently if Matt Corral doesn't get hurt, because they were starting to catch fire a little bit, I thought. But I think what people miss is that, like, they gave up, 7 points for 3 quarters in that game? And that's not a particularly good defense going into the year. It hasn't been good defense for years. And that's the Big 12 champ. Can't score on them. That's the kind of stuff it did. And I think the mid-level teams were more consistent, much more complete. Arkansas kind of teams, Baylor's an example, Michigan State in the Big Ten. Those teams in the transfer era are a lot less likely to have that glaring weakness that causes them to get blown out by teams with a lot more talent, and they become tougher outs as a result. But the other thing I will say is it does confirm one of our big beliefs from recent years. I think wide receivers and high-level wide receiver play is basically maybe the overriding key in the RPO era. And we all want to point to elite quarterback play, and yeah, I think that's a huge factor in it. But it is really dadgum obvious that if you have high-level receivers that can win one-on-ones in the RPO, you say RPO era, under RPO rules, with the inability of the safety to really read, run, and pass properly, it's just way too easy to force one-on-ones with those receivers. And if you've got a couple guys like that can win on a consistent basis, or even one that really wins on a consistent basis, you're almost unstoppable. And that's why, that's why I think personally, I was reaffirmed in the way I think elite offenses worked, but I also think we have to recalibrate a little bit. Not so much to say that defenses have caught up as much as I think defenses just got better. And the transfer era and the extra year has made defenses better, not schematically better, but from a personnel standpoint, quality standpoint, better than they have been in other years.
So Mike Farino said, I know JSN was getting covered at times by running back versus Utah, but can you talk about how the Rose Bowl demonstrated why Ohio State wound up letting Williams leave? 347 yards was insane. Yeah, I mean, against air, 347 yards is insane. And honestly, I think if you listen to, like, if NFL scouts were polled on this, they'd probably say he should go higher than Olave or Wilson. And look, I mean, and we can get into this a little bit, but I think that Jameson Williams was a phenomenal receiver for exactly what Alabama needed. I think he is a really, really good receiver. In my opinion, before injury, he was not a top 10 pick off the board receiver. I think he's an excellent guy, maybe a late first round guy. But if you watch the Cincinnati game, he had a real hard time getting off of jams. He had a real hard time, even with all his speed, getting off of press coverage. He did operate a little bit in space on design space plays, but his bread and butter is that vertical threat. He's going to test well, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's ready to run NFL level routes, route tree, and be that in depth as a wide receiver. Josh, this is where we have a natural segue to talk about some stuff that's probably going to get clipped and cut and repasted and requoted or whatever. But, and I'm going to try to avoid getting a little ranty, but a bunch of Ohio State fans got upset because someone quoted you from early in the year. I think it was after the Toledo game, where CJ Stroud was clearly struggling. He was struggling from a yards per attempt standpoint, I think, off the top of my head, and he was struggling from a putting up points efficiently standpoint. I think they had 24 or 28 points against Oregon, and he had just gobs of yards. They struggled against Toledo. They really struggled early against Minnesota. So we had, and this is what we do on this channel, is we work with what data we have. And at that point, Caleb Williams had just taken over at Oklahoma, and he was just dunking on people. And if he admittedly had less talented wide receivers, I think by the end of the year, in my opinion, CJ Stroud was a better quarterback. He was more comfortable in that offense. But based on the data we had at the time, I don't think saying that CJ Williams had more upside, especially as a runner, as a complement to his game, was that far off base. So by the end of the year, Williams, Stroud, where are you putting those two, and maybe get into that a little bit?
I mean, by the end of the year, Stroud was the better quarterback. And the statement I'd made at the time was that I felt like if Williams had enrolled at Ohio State, I felt like there was a good chance Williams would have been the starter. And out of context, that sounds like me saying that Williams was the better quarterback last year. But what I was trying to say, even at that point, was I feel like if you took Caleb Williams and you put him on that Ohio State team in that Ohio State system with that Ohio State coaching staff, I felt like they could have made a phenomenal player for what they wanted to do in Ryan Day's system. Stroud is not a particularly good runner. He is a good passer, but Williams has some unique gifts that I think Ryan Day could have gotten a lot more out of than what Oklahoma managed to get out of last year. I do think Stroud by the end of the year was a better player. He was a better player. He was throwing really accurate passes. That Utah game was, like you said, even against air, those numbers are really impressive. And they were putting balls on the money. I still have some some hesitation with him. Stroud, as we saw in the Michigan game, does not perform nearly as well when he's not able to throw on rhythm. There's a thing with a lot of players, particularly, I could get into like more detail with it. I've seen a lot of guys in particular that are long striders, taller quarterbacks that have issues setting their feet. It was something we flagged about Ritter going into the Alabama game, and I think that was 110% true. Ritter is not the same quarterback we did that doesn't set his feet. I think Stroud has that tendency, but that is a nit. Stroud is an excellent passer, but I just want to make clear, even in that discussion, right? We look at things like yards per attempt. CJ Stroud was second in the country. Caleb Williams was seventh. If you look at quarterback rating, CJ Stroud second in the country. Caleb Williams was fifth. So this saying it's absurd that Williams would be the starter, I think, is a little harsh because he's a top 5 player nationally, statistically. I just thought that he'd be even higher if he was at Ohio State with those receivers in those system. But certainly by the end of the year, Stroud was the better player. I don't know what happens if you reverse the coaching staff and Stroud is in, you reverse the environment. Stroud has to play in the Oklahoma system with all the issues they had last year, et cetera, et cetera. It's telling to me that Rattler went from a really effective quarterback 2 years ago to what he was last year. And it's hard to interpret. As for the whole controversy thing, and there hasn't been a lot of stuff in the comments, and I don't want to belabor it, but I will say this one thing, and you can confirm it if you want on your end. As far as I'm aware, everyone that we have ever agreed to be on their show, we have been on their show. And so that's all I'll say about it. Beyond that, it was just a comment in October about where I thought the players were. And I think Stroud ended up being a player at the end of the year. So that is what it is.
Yeah. And there was a couple of comments about we were ducking somebody. We don't duck anybody. One, this is not our day job. Like, this is something we do for fun. This is why it took us so long to get back on this show, because after the last second ticks off on the championship game, we go straight into work and family. And I've got a 2, 4, and 6-year-old and a 2-month-old puppy that we just brought home last night. So we're tired in this house and got a lot going on. But I'll also say that one of the benefits of our platform is we don't have to please all people. So we take really strong stances a lot of times. And like the Stetson Bennett thing, like I think the tight end situation at Georgia, like we've been right a lot. We've been right more than we've been wrong. When we're wrong, we own it, but also we're not wrong if we're only working with a limited set of data. It's easy to go to the end of the year and say, look who's the best team. I picked the national champion. It's easy to say your favorite player is the best player in the country. And then when he's really good at the end of the year, say, see, I was right. But like the same people that are killing us for our take with limited data on CJ Stroud versus Caleb Williams, we're saying at the end of the year that Bryce Young is trash and overrated. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And no, we don't have to belabor that point anymore. Josh, I do want to talk a little bit in general about, I know you touched on it some, but there's an opportunity this year, especially with Ohio State and Alabama offensively. I feel like this is the first time in a while we've had a lot of incumbent, already successful quarterbacks. And I feel like this might be the year where unfortunately, because I really enjoyed the defensive struggles this year, 2022 might be the year where offenses really kind of step back into dictating games and dictating sort of conversations nationally. What do you think?
I think that's likely. There were a lot of holdovers from last year, from COVID years, that caused a lot of defenses to be inflated. A lot of those guys are gone, and a lot of the offensive. It was kind of weird, right? A lot of the best offensive players all went in the draft, and then a lot of the best defensive players didn't, and from the best teams. And this year, you're going to kind of see the opposite. Offenses are all going to take a step forward, I would think, and defenses, a lot of them are going to take a step back. Heck, even Georgia, I'm not sure what exactly their situation will be next year. They got a lot of receivers that are getting healthier, and they're probably going to be a better team. And I mean, Killtack 9, he had a super chat a while back. He's been super supportive of the channel, and I want to appreciate that. And he noted Georgia got blessed by the injury gods. Note on the defensive side of the ball, they got blessed. But I will note on the offensive side of the ball, in their defense, they were never healthy at wide receiver the whole year.
It's true.
And Pickens was supposed to be their superstar stud, made a big play in the championship game, but as we noted, still not like a consistent factor. He's not healthy enough even now. They lost Blaylock before the year started. I don't know that any of the guys starting for him are going to start next year. And they're going to be a lot different. Alabama offensively was crippled basically from week 4 on due to their running back situation, as good as they were. And, obviously the receiver situation got broken for them. So a lot of these teams that were good, are going to take a step forward. I think Ohio State is the one question mark I have long term. Smith and Jigma is a great player, but they had him and Olave and Wilson all on the field at the same time.
Well, Harrison was killing it in the Rose Bowl, and he looked, as a route runner, he looked better than any of them.
This is not my thing is, and this is no way an insult towards Ohio State. We had an entire segment, right, on our Rose Bowl preview questioning Utah's pass defense because of some weird statistical anomalies. They only played one competent passing attack. That was Oregon State, who wasn't good, and they lit them up. They had and they played that Rose Bowl with a converted running back at corner. So I thought what they did would have been impressive against air. It was the throws were being made and the plays that were being made were incredibly impressive. But I still hold my horses a little bit of evaluating what that's going to do against, I don't know. You play Michigan in the year, you play Wisconsin, and how do you win the Big Ten with that? I think that's a very different question.
Well, Josh, is the question really like, I know we've kind of gotten away from the original question, but is for me, for Ohio State, like, I think that they can score against an elite team. They can score 30 to 40 if they need to. Like, the question is not really their offense for me. It's, are they going to give up 52 again? That's my question, because this year defensively, Michigan, we saw against Georgia why Michigan had no business beating Ohio State this year. And they didn't just beat them, they beat them comfortably. And it's because that defense was just giving ground and giving ground and giving ground.
Yep.
And they were kind of manhandled against Oregon too. So isn't it really like, let's settle the offensive side and say they're going to be top 3 in the country offensively? I still got questions because of that defense.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I don't know how you predict it. I mean, they've Ryan Day has spared no punches in replacing defensive coaches trying to turn that around.
True. That's true.
And I think a lot of places are probably going to follow suit. I know Alabama's had some weird shuffling. What was it, like their cornerback coach ended up went to like Oklahoma or something in a lateral move. It's funny, Alabama, a lot of those major programs, you'll see their coaches make a lateral move from Ohio State or Alabama or Georgia or something. That usually means they weren't wanted, because even their guys they don't want are probably coaches that somebody else that's named will want. But a lot of these schools, I think, were unhappy with their performance last year, and Ohio State is absolutely number 1 in that list. But from an offensive, like, explosion standpoint, yeah, I think a lot of them are going to go forward. And look, Alabama lost 2 wide receivers. Their problem was they lost wide receivers in games, really, right? And Jameson Williams, you can talk about the conservative play calling. I guarantee you they were trying to set a bunch of stuff up to hit him downfield in the late second and third quarters of that game. And when he went down, the reality is it really did cripple their playbook. And when they go into next year, they've got a lot of young receivers. I mean, they're still Alabama, and they're gonna figure things out, and they're gonna get a real receiving core. And a lot of other teams are going to figure it out too. So I do agree with you. I think offense in general is probably going to take a step forward next season.
Lamar Stevens with a super chat said the transfer portal combined with NIL will birth some elite defenses. Offenses too, but I agree with that. Like it seems like, and this is where we talk about how NIL, transfer portal, like no consequence, instant eligibility might help some of the lesser teams, but like Jaleel Billingsley going to Texas, no offense to Texas fans, but right now you're a lesser team than Alabama. Going to Texas is dead weight for Alabama. If you saw the national championship game or you saw the last 6 games of the season, he wasn't going to play next year. He's in the doghouse to start the season. He was kind of going through the motions all year. That guy was dead weight. So Alabama actually gets a scholarship back with him going out the door, and then they get a 5-star DB coming in, right?
How, was it like week 5 when we started the discussion about how the 2 tight end set stuff Alabama was doing just wasn't working?
Yeah.
And that was mainly about their expectations for Billingsley, I think, and how poorly that developed over the course of the year.
And to Lamar's point, like, and I hate to do this since it's an LSU guy leaving, but like Alabama is going to be upgrading at corner at a spot that they're already going to be decent going into next year. They're going to be upgrading there. And so the pain they feel with Jalen Armour Davis leaving or whatever is not that big a pain. And I feel like NIL is going to do that for some elite teams and maybe not some not so elite teams. But this leads me into a question. I know we got another super chat, but I want to get a little bit away from like Alabama, Georgia with this question. Does it feel kind of dirty that Lincoln Riley is basically fleecing Oklahoma? Like, I hate to do this comparison, and I know Nick Saban has been called every name in the book, but I can't imagine him leaving a school, going somewhere else, and taking all the best players that are willing to come with him to the next school. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe he's done something similar in the past. I couldn't see him doing that. I think this is a really bad look for Lincoln Riley. Maybe it gets him a win in the short term, but it is the opposite to me of what college football should be.
I don't care for it in the least. I mean, I just honestly, I despise it, the way that it's gone down, the number of players that have left Oklahoma to follow him to USC. And some of it may be, guys that just chose on their own to do it. But a lot of the Oklahoma it's been funny. I've seen a couple tweets from Oklahoma players talking about like, hey, it's funny. These guys have spent all year trashing the coaches, and now they've left to go follow those same coaches, right? It seems like a lot of these guys are kind of known to be at least somewhat discontent at Oklahoma, and now they're following to the same coach somewhere else at USC. This is one of many reasons why they had a 1-year delay on transfers, and why we've always said this isn't I don't want to go into one of our big rants. We really do need to have a roundtable with some of the other guys. I don't know if it's Josh Pate or RJ Young or whatnot about NIL and the transfer portal and how all this is going. But we've been probably beating the drum longer than anyone, I would guess, on the fact that going to unregulated NIL with no transfer penalty has massive unintended consequences. And as we always say, everybody used to go 70 and a 55, and you just legalize going 110. And that is going to have real impacts to competitive advantages. It's going to cause a lot of serious corruption issues. Basketball was really bad with the AAU, and you just legalized football being twice as bad. And I think this is the first of many such instances where such things are going to happen. And it's really, this isn't a dig at USC in particular, but it is not surprising to me that an LA-based school with all the media stuff that's based out of there is the first one that ends up sort of centered on such a controversy.
Yeah. And to me, it's like, look, I get that you want to maybe move on and you see this as a better move, although I don't know that Oklahoma is a lesser brand than USC. But Oklahoma made you a multimillionaire. Oklahoma gave you and supported you in such a way that got you to the point where you could go get this USC job that you deem as better. And to repay that, you spit in the face of them and take as many, you exploit this short term thing that's going to go away eventually, fleece them of their best players. So you cripple them even further and take some coaches with you. It's just, to me, that tells me that he's not going to be a long term success there. I think that he might win a couple games and then he's going to bolt the NFL. I hate it so much.
Here's a point that I want people to remember that's like it's here and it's made things wonderful and it's here to stay. Let me remind you, how long has NIL been in place? 6 months. It's been in place 6 months and it's already done all this. What I'm trying to remember when the free transfer rule passed was what, a year and a half ago? Something like that, maybe 2.5 years. But I think it's been a year and a half.
Yeah, something like that.
Guys, we have barely scratched the surface to where this is going to go. The whole thing with, why did Texas A&M end up with a number one recruiting class? Because they bought the recruiting class. That's not tinfoil hat theory. They legally bought a recruiting class. They pooled money. They created NIL deals. They created endorsement deals. And I want everyone to remember that, yeah, you can do that to get recruits. There's no reason you can't do the same thing to get the players from other schools. There's no reason USC can't pull money to pull the players from Oklahoma. There's no reason Ohio State can't pull money to pull all the players from Michigan State. And I just don't think people quite realize how bad that Pandora's box can be. And I'm always gloom and doom, but I will say, and hopefully people agree with it, I'm more often than not right when I'm gloom and doom.
We called this 2 years ago. Like there's receipts from 2 years ago where we said the only way this is not a Pandora's box is if you put guardrails on it, reasonable ones that allow everybody to get paid.
It was like 3 years ago we did that video about guardrails you can put on the system. See, we went into a rant, but there are ways that you can. I think it's a good thing to allow players to have some access to funds in college football. I do, to have access to some NIL. But it needs to be actual NIL, actual endorsements, actual value to the players for that kind of stuff. That is absolutely 100% not what's happening. Every offensive lineman at Texas is going to be given $50,000. That's an absolute very real thing. That's not because the backup offensive guard's endorsement is worth $50,000. No one knows who he is. It is the most thin veneer. And that is the result of absolutely no oversight and regulation. And something is going to have to be done about it.
And Jacob said this is basically the NFL, and I would argue this way, way, way worse.
No.
Because NFL has contracts, and they have collective bargained agreements with the players' union that says you can't just say, hey, if I'm, the Steelers and we're one elite wide receiver short of walking through the Super Bowl, which they're not, but that's all they needed. And they go out and pluck the best wide receiver because there's a bank name on the stadium that's willing to give that guy an obscene amount of money that he's not really worth for 1 year just so they can win a Super Bowl, so he dips on his team and leaves in the middle of a contract. That's what we have in college football. We don't have that in NFL. You can't just buy players with whoever's name's on the building. You have salary caps. You have certain level that you can pay a guy to come. There's guidelines for how you pay rookies, how you pay veterans. There's all of that, and they can't just bounce around and go wherever they want to go. Caleb Williams was the starting quarterback. This just summarizes how bad this is. Caleb Williams was the starting quarterback of an 11-win team after his freshman year. He's an incumbent starter, and he put his name in the transfer portal with his hand out. That is absolutely ridiculous, and I hate where we are right now.
Yeah. The best way to understand this is it would be like if it were legal for the New England Patriots to offer a $10 million endorsement deal to AJ Green to sign with them, and then when he goes over, they pay him zero salary on the books. And I say $10 million, it'd be more than that, right? Like in the pros, it'd be like 50 million, right? And we want to win a Super Bowl this year. We'll pay you 50 million over 2 years, but our salary will be zero. So it doesn't affect our salary cap. That's what people miss. The salary cap aspect of it, the draft aspect of the pros. There's a lot of controls in place. They're under contract for a certain number of years. There's free agency. You have none of that in college. You have none of those controls. And I will tell you right now, if NIL existed in the pros as it does now, it would count against the salary cap. That's the crazy thing to me. Like the pros, you have an individual independent endorsements for a certain amount of money, but if you were getting endorsements that were facilitated through the organization for a large amount of money, abso-freaking-lutely, that would count as part of your salary in the NFL. And they would 100% put that against the salary cap. They would never, ever put up with that kind of a loophole.
Well, and
So we
Josh,
ended
this
up in
is
a rant, but yeah.
like this is what we said all along. This is going to end up hurting the little guy and keeping the rich richer. The whole reason there's a salary cap and the whole reason that would go against their salary in such a situation in the NFL is because small market teams, they've decided for the betterment of the sport that small market teams don't need to compete constantly with the Yankees. It's in every sport, whoever the Yankees are, they don't want to be able to just buy championships. And there's a lot of people on Twitter, and I want to get more into positive stuff, but this is the last thing I'll say. You said that Texas A&M bought their class. They did it within the rules. So that wasn't they're cheaters. They did it within the rules, but they absolutely bought their class. And somebody on Twitter said, you don't see the momentum of people wanting to go there to win a national championship. And I'm like, that was after the fact. That was all these 5-star players are getting bought. Therefore, I'll go there. And now we have enough players that maybe we can win a national championship. Nothing about what Jimbo Fisher has done at Texas A&M indicates that they have more inertia than Alabama or Ohio State or Georgia, who all got beat out by A&M for tons of recruits because of some inertia to win a national championship. It was dollars and cents, and I don't blame the players. I don't blame the players, and I don't blame the organizations for leveraging a loophole. I blame the people who allowed it to happen.
And people are talking about the $30 million story. I know the $30 million story isn't real, but I'm telling you, it wasn't $30 million, but they absolutely did use the NIL program as how they got those players. That is true. And it was legal. It was within the rules. And it wasn't a dirty thing they did. They played that system well because there's a lot of money in Texas. And frankly, their endorsements and all are worth a lot more at Texas. But yeah, and again, I'm going to end with the same thing I said to start with. It's been just 6 months. So if you want to talk about the thing that drives me nuts is when someone says on Twitter, well, look what happened in the playoff. Clearly NIL doesn't matter. You haven't seen an NIL recruit yet.
Right.
They just signed. So don't tell me about what NIL is or isn't going to do based off this season. I'm telling you, based off what just happened in recruiting, you're going to see the impact in NIL in current transfers, and you're going to mainly see the impact in NIL in about 2 years. And that's when I think people will finally realize it. And this, maybe it's a transition point to talk. I'd like to circle back a little bit on the championship game because I think there's a lot of stuff to peg on it. But the sport of college football is not a quick turnaround sport. And the way I approach it, and the reason I think we're pretty successful predicting games and looking at things, is that I am really stubborn and slow to change my opinions on things. I view ups and downs as being unpredictable emotional swings. I'm not saying football isn't emotional. I'm saying that it's unpredictably emotional. But by and large, teams are good due to things they did 2 years ago and things they do over a 2 or 3 year span. And you build to a certain point. And that is sort of the nature of the sport. Now, NIL and the transfer portal is changing that so it's more dynamic because you can bring in guys and fix things faster. But at least that's the thought. I think the reality is, the Jameson Williams situation, and now what I don't think people realize what's about to happen with like Jahmyr Gibbs going to Alabama and Elias Ricks going to Alabama, that these schools are starting to even amp up the rate at which they're taking, they're taking maybe if not the best back in the ACC, at least one of the top 3, right? Like the best back in another conference is going to the best team in the country. And I think it's only
going to a team with a bunch of 5-star running backs already on the roster.
Yeah, this is only going to accelerate the rate at which the haves and have-nots happen. And yes, it's really bad right now, but it's like playoff expansion, right? Like we had a playoff and then things got really uneven. So how are we going to fix the fact that the playoff made things uneven? Let's have more of the thing that made it uneven. It can absolutely always get worse. But anyway, let's move on to another topic.
So I think it's worth maybe discussing when we look ahead to 2022. I think Alabama and Georgia are going to be there. They're going to be right there. Ohio State's going to be right there. Georgia actually might not play a ranked team in 2022. Looking at their schedule, because I think they draw Auburn and Mississippi State from the West and the East. Who knows what it's going to be? It just depends on how it ends up in the year. But if you were to pick a team from not the Big Ten and not the SEC to be a legitimate contender, maybe not to win it all, but to be a contender next year and to belong on the playing field in the playoffs with whomever they get from the Big Ten or the SEC, give me a team.
You want one not in the SEC and the Big Ten?
Yep, I do.
Thank you for making my job easy.
Well, if it was easy, it wouldn't be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I do think Lincoln Riley has a chance to turn around USC quick. Their line play is not good, and that's not going to change overnight. They might be able to fix some things with the transfer portal. But the big thing there, I have a very low opinion of what the coaching staff was doing or accomplishing at USC. And I say this a lot, right? That if you've got a bad coaching staff in place, what you can often see is a massive turnaround when a new coaching staff is hired. And so I think USC could very quickly become one of the stars in the Pac-12. Oregon had momentum. A lot of that was lost with Cristobal. They had turnover with a lot of their best players last year. And then elsewhere in the country, it's hard for me to point to someone and say, yeah, that's the team, right? I mean, Oklahoma is sort of in turmoil. I don't think Texas is not back. I think they're building, but it's not going to happen in a year. You look at teams like Baylor, who was super senior laden. They're very unlikely to be better next year. Clemson is one that's sitting there that had a rough year. I mean, a rough year where they lost like 3 games, and the defense was stellar the entire year. I mean, they were phenomenal the whole year.
They're losing a pretty important coach, though.
Yeah, they're losing Venables. They're losing Venables and probably a lot of players. A lot of people are saying Clemson. My concern is maybe the freshman quarterback comes in and is ready to go. That rarely happens. I don't see any signs where they're going to magically fix the offensive line issues, which were really the Achilles heel. I don't think they're going to fix all the issues with a wide receiving core that doesn't have balance. I don't think DJ Uiagalelei. I think if you put him on a really good team that block well and can have vertical players, he could be really good because I say this all the time. He can make any throw on the field, but he will miss every throw on the field more often than most. And that is the absolute worst thing for what they have right now because they're a possession-based offense with big receivers that don't get a ton of separation and a bad offensive line that doesn't give them time. I don't think that's going to fix overnight. So, I mean, am I just left with USC? I mean, man, tell me I'm wrong, but I have a hard time looking around the country and really, I can't think of anybody. Sure, maybe USC and Clemson make the playoff, but right now, in terms of playing with Ohio State or Alabama, I have a hard time believing that they're going to be overly competitive.
The only way I think it happens is if Baylor's defense is as good as Georgia's defense was this year. My concern is they looked so inept at quarterback this year. Offensively, they looked not great. I would say Oklahoma normally, but Lincoln Riley took all the players that I am interested in, right? So that's a little bit of a concern too. Yeah, I asked you that question basically because I don't have the answer either. I think the only answer that's possible is USC. And I do think that we miss out. We don't think about, or maybe we take for granted what the Big Ten has done to get better on both sides of the ball in line play. They've adjusted well to what the SEC really owned for about a decade. And the SEC is still there, obviously, but the Big Ten has done a good job of kind of getting close to where they are in line play. Everybody else is trying to survive on scheme and skill players. And Lincoln Riley is bringing over a lot of skill players. But if they're struggling in the line play, it won't matter when they play Ohio State or Alabama or Georgia. It won't matter. So, and I say that to say this is why it's absurd that we think we need auto bids for and 8 teams in playoffs, because you and I would struggle, and we watch all the conferences, including the Pac-12. You and I would struggle to come up with a fourth team that's not Alabama, Georgia, or Ohio State for next year, but we certainly would struggle to come up with 8. And we saw that again this year in the playoffs that really only 2 teams belong there. So I think it's premature because obviously a lot's going to change between now and next year. But I asked you that question to kind of make a point, and you did make that point that we don't know. Like we don't know because there's probably not anybody that's that good. Okay, so now
Let me say, I'm looking at ESPN's way too early top 25, and outside the Big Ten and the SEC, and you got to go all the way down to 6th, and it's Notre Dame. 7 is Utah, and 8 is NC State. And I'm gonna be that guy and say, to me, it's almost a joke. Like Utah is reasonably good for the Pac-12 and has been effective. Utah does not have the horses to play in a playoff. NC
Josh,
State,
Utah, I want you to continue this point with this added little bit of detail because a lot of people don't watch Pac-12 football. And I know they changed things offensively after these games. Utah did not play a P5 out of conference. They lost to BYU and San Diego State early in the year, and they gave up 43 in a loss later in the year to Oregon State. That's the team that a lot of people in the chat are saying could compete with Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, and I just don't see it.
No, that was we talked a lot about the fact that Utah was a really bad matchup for Ohio State defensively. Like when we did a preview, my whole thing was both these teams are horrible matchups for the opposing defense. And I thought it was going to be, I was thinking like 33-30, which even that ended up being conservative. But I knew it was going to be a high-scoring game that I thought Ohio State would pull out because they hit on everything Ohio State struggled with defensively. I know, and the tough thing for a lot of Ohio State fans to accept is they're saying, well, they almost beat Ohio State. They almost beat Ohio State because of the reason that Ohio State was not in the playoff last year, frankly.
Which is that Ohio State was missing everybody, except for Caleb Williams. I'm sorry, CJ Stroud.
Yeah, and they're like their linebacking core was missing a bunch of guys. Their front seven wasn't the same. Over the course of the season and where they were at in that game, they weren't a great team against physical offenses anyway. But like if Notre Dame, Utah, and NC State are 6, 7, and 8, and they are playing, NC State plays Alabama, Utah plays Ohio State again, and Ohio State I think next year would kill NC State if they're number 2, and then Notre Dame gets Georgia, you're going to see like 3 40-6 games. That's what's likely if those are 1, 2, and 3.
There's a good question about Ohio State, and I'd like you to touch on this. Someone said, so Ohio State plays Notre Dame out of conference, which Ohio State deserves a ton of credit for out of conference scheduling. Ohio State, Georgia plays 2 Power Fives. They don't have to play 2. They play Georgia Tech every year, but they do it anyway. Alabama always schedules a named team. Texas, Oklahoma do really well. UCLA does really well. USC does really well. I just wanted to say that. But they play Notre Dame out of conference. They have good Western Division crossers. And then they play in what we have said forever is a very tough. They're always the second toughest. Some years maybe the best division in college football in the Big Ten East. Do they have the toughest schedule? I would argue, Josh, especially if you look at Alabama, although I think Texas will be better. They play Texas next year. You look at Alabama's schedule and Georgia's schedule, they're not great. I would argue that Ohio State probably does have the toughest schedule of the people who will be contending for a title. Now, there are teams in the SEC West that play Georgia, which means they also have to play Alabama, LSU, and then a Power 5 opponent. Those probably have tougher schedules, but they're not going to contend. Auburn's not going to contend next year for national title. So I think it's safe to say that probably Ohio State does have the toughest schedule in the country next year.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty safe statement because of the way the rotations work out. I think I keep forgetting that Alabama plays Texas in week 2, which could be a really interesting game on a lot of levels. But yeah, I mean that Notre Dame game with Ohio State is an instant credibility game for both teams, or barometer game for both teams, and then the Big Ten East is good. They've been solidly good. The weird thing to separate them is number one and number two in the SEC have consistently been really, really otherworldly in recent years. Georgia and Alabama this year, and people want to get into the depth of the SEC because they look at the other games. Like, look, you're usually talking like SEC Baylor, for example, Baylor and Ole Miss. Ole Miss was, and I'll pull up the standings real quick. Like, where they ended up ranked in the SEC? Was it third technically? I guess so. Yeah, I mean they were third in the SEC, lost 2 games in conference, and they're playing the Big 10 champ or Big 12 champ, right? Baylor, and they played with them pretty well. It felt like they were pretty evenly matched.
Not a
Georgia or
quarterback.
Alabama, and the trick is Georgia and Alabama. Like Alabama played Ole Miss, and it wasn't a competitive game. And Georgia would have crushed Ole Miss. So I think the trick though is, but when you're playing in your own division, if you're Alabama, if you're Georgia, you don't play each other in the regular season, and it doesn't matter with it being balanced with one elite on either side of the division, and you're just looking at the division schedule. Ohio State schedule ends up being at least comparable, even with an SEC West schedule. But we'll see what happens with Ole Miss and Arkansas this year. Arkansas has a chance to take a big step forward next season. That could be a really, really, really good team. So it is what it is.
And somebody said that Alabama's going to be really good. I agree with that. I think they've got a lot of pieces coming. So it's interesting. Georgia doesn't play anybody next year, and I say this: they don't play anybody. They still have an SEC schedule. They still will play some decent teams. They're not going to play an elite team until the SEC championship game. I'm interested to see how good they are next year if they are dominant like they were this year, because they lose a ton of people. And we got a lot of non-SEC fans that are listening to us, that follow us. Maybe break down, don't have to go down the whole roster, but maybe break down just how much Georgia's losing. It's kind of like 2017. It's like every 4 or 5 years, they have this really senior laden veteran team, and then they lose them all to the NFL.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't think I've seen the full list recently for Georgia, but you guys like Trayvon Walker and Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, Nakobe Dean.
Basically, they're starting 11 if Nolan Smith goes.
Yeah, am I remembering right that the entire starting 11 is draft eligible when
Yes.
it ended up being the healthy 11 that started in the title game? I'm pretty sure they're all draft eligible. I haven't seen. It's been about a week since I looked at it, and most of the announcements nationally have come in that time span. I will say off the cuff, we haven't been doing this in a large part because of my part. A lot of people know that I'm a patent lawyer, but I've been dealing with a lawsuit, so I've been like totally under a rock and barely managed to watch a championship game. They're all pretty much all draft eligible. There was some issues with slot corner was what I was remembering. That's why I talked about them being at the end of the year where that was kind of in the air, but they could lose potentially everybody else around it. So you end up with a pretty well overhauled team. The trick with them is they do recruit at an awesome level, right? And we always talk about defense. Defenses can be great either through tremendous experience or through tremendous recruiting. Probably, I would say recruiting directly impacts defense more than it does offense, honestly. You get a lot of great offensive players that weren't necessarily studs in high school, but if you got an elite talent defense, that's almost always good. But yeah, like people are talking about guys that might come back or leave, but at this point we're kind of talking about exemptions, right? Like Chris Smith, Ringo, Jalen Carter, and maybe Nolan Smith. That's not a lot of from what you had, right?
And thank God Bowers isn't draft eligible because he would be a top 10 pick.
I mean, Georgia's going to have to be kind of reloading on the defensive side of the ball, which they will mostly do. But that was statistically, one of those once every 10-year kind of defenses. It's probably not going to be quite the same set. Let me go to a super chat because I think this deals with this question. Joseph L. said, is there any way you can say that Bama shouldn't win the title next year? Young wide receivers could hold them back, but I believe they will develop. And isn't that kind of where we're going with it, right? Because we always talk about when you talk about if a team's good or not, it's always relational. And, Ohio State loses just as many as Alabama does, even from their team. Georgia loses a ton. Is it really, I mean, is it just Alabama's title to win? I can see a couple of flaws, but I can also see the argument.
So here's a couple of things that I will say about Alabama. Like on paper, I think that they will have the best team next year. Where they lose Mechie and Jameson Williams, Ohio State is backfilling with two future NFL wide receivers, and they're at Alabama. They're question marks. I think Alabama is probably a little better on offensive line because that offensive line ended up okay by the end of the year, and they've got some of those pieces coming back, and they've got a lot of talent, 5-star talent behind them. And I think the defense is going to be okay. The question is, if Bill O'Brien goes to the Jaguars or goes to the Dolphins or goes anywhere and leaves Alabama, then it's always a question mark of whether the guy you bring in is going to mesh well and be able to call a perfect game in an elite game scenario. Alabama's gotten kind of lucky the last couple of years. I think Bill O'Brien called a great postseason for Alabama. The last 3 games really, really did. Had some questionable games throughout the year, but I think he was at an elite level at the end of the year. Obviously, Sark 2 years in a row, elite offensive coordinator. But we saw in 2018, Alabama had probably by far the most talented team in the country, but had 2 coordinators that really didn't get it done when the lights were brightest. And so you never know. There's this question mark of who you bring in because you're not bringing in Sark next year if Bob leaves. So that's the question for me is like, when you have a question mark, then there's always an opening for somebody else. So with Alabama, I think it's offensive coordinator. With Georgia, I think it's, can you field an offense that can cover for a defense that's not holding everybody to 6 points anymore? Because they won't next year with all that they're losing. They're also losing their defensive coordinator. And then can Ohio State find a defense? So every one of these teams has something going on. And then A&M, if they can find a quarterback, if they can find an offensive scheme that can make them, a threat offensively, then they're a challenger. So it's like, I think to your question, the answer is Alabama has the fewest question marks of all of them, but they all have one big question mark.
Yeah, I'd agree. And in the national title, there was really one play that I feel like summarized the entire game. And I wanted to get this in at some point. And that was the play where Jameson Williams got hurt, but it was the totality of the play. There were 3 things that happened in that play. The first thing is that Georgia got significant pressure on Bryce Young. They gave pressure all night. Some people in the chat have been saying the stories out there on Bryce Young. It's not the story out there on Bryce Young. It was the story was out there on how you would take Alabama, because Alabama's offensive line could not handle overload blitzes. They struggled with edge guys. If you brought more or brought as many as they could block, they had real problems leaking, and consistently somebody would get beat. Or if you brought pressure, they just had the inability to slide out and be able to attack a guy or block a guy that was a speed rusher on the edge in those situations. And they get pressure on Bryce Young, so he backpedals and throws off his back foot. That throw slows down Jameson Williams. Jameson Williams catches the ball awkwardly and while turning tears his ACL and goes down, right? But I think a lot of people focus on the ACL and that injury aspect of it and say that was the game. And then some people say, well, take a step further and go, well, if Bryce Young doesn't make a bad throw, that was the game. But why did he make a bad throw? It's because Georgia's player made a play that Alabama's offensive line didn't stop due to the pass rush. And that was kind of the whole game, right? As Alabama's offensive line was consistently getting overwhelmed in that game, which was causing Alabama's offense's problems. And that was due to 2 things. This is actually answering the question we're talking about, right? The offensive line at Alabama was such a problem that in the Auburn game, the LSU game, the Georgia game, and the championship Georgia game, it really negated all the advantages Alabama had. So as a question mark, that question mark, if it's not fixed, will cripple them. It doesn't matter what they do otherwise. If that offensive line doesn't improve significantly, they're going to have the same fatal flaw that can be exposed by all kinds of different teams. And they lose their left tackle, which for all their faults, they've got a top 5 draft pick at left tackle last year. It's
Right.
just the rest of the line was so crappy for the most part, to be blunt. It didn't matter. And it's crazy that you can solidify one side of the line and be that bad. So it's obvious they didn't have a high level option because he wasn't starting last year. So I don't know how they're going to fix that problem. And if they don't fix the problem, they're going to have a lot of issues. But on the other side of the ball, Georgia got pressure with guys that are all going to leave. Like that play, all the guys that were, I forget who was, I think it may have been Trayvon Walker, but I know for a fact whoever was blitzing him, because they're all gone, are all going to be gone. So I don't know next year, Williams isn't going to be there to be wide open in the first place. Georgia's not going to have a pass rush. Alabama's going to have a totally different offensive line. Every aspect of that play that made the play happen the way it did is going to be different. And everybody focuses on Bryce Young as a passer, but Bryce just delivered the football as best he could. Everything else that made that play happen the way it happened, every part of that is changing or needs to change. And so I do think there are a tremendous number of question marks. And I think the key to the offseason really will be whether Alabama can fix their offensive line issues, because if they do that, they have a massive advantage over everyone else in college football. But that is a huge if. And until that happens, they're just as vulnerable as everybody else, at least in my opinion.
Hey, Josh, can I rant for a second?
Sure, I just did.
So Kendall came through with a super chat about something that's near and dear to my heart as it relates to college football. So y'all get ready for this. Kendall said that I think Kayvon Thibodeau's comments about Alabama's education will at some point backfire against a school like Oregon that's more committed to someone like Phil Knight than a very good coach like Mario Cristobal. Now, I don't know that I agree with the second part. Like, I think Cristobal wanted to go. Like he's a legacy guy at Miami. Like I don't know that that's like he probably would have stayed there for a long time if that job didn't open up. They're committed to Phil Knight because without Phil Knight, Oregon football would be Oregon State football. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with these comments because they're so ridiculous and so ignorant on so many levels. And I'm not even going to get into the stigmatism part. I hate when college football fans, and in this case, a college football player who, by the way, majored in broadcast journalism, if he really cared about education, he would have gone to USC. USC is the number 1 broadcast journalism school in the country, and number 2, which I think is Georgia, is like way down below them. There's like 16% acceptance rates, then 55% acceptance rate. So he didn't care about education. The thing that I hate is when people are snobbish about their school's academics and project that onto athletics. Most schools, if you're not Stanford, if you're not Vanderbilt, if you're not Duke, you're offering the same players. Your standards for admission, maybe Notre Dame, I don't think Michigan, although they say that it is. Most of these schools all offer the same players. They are football factories. They bring you in. You got a team of tutors to get you through the easiest classes possible for most players. Also, most big state schools are all the same. I hire engineers. I interview them almost every day. If you don't have MIT or Harvard or Stanford on your resume, and even then, most cases, I don't really care. I don't care where you went to college. The differences between Alabama or Georgia and Florida and Oregon are negligible. What you do once you get to college is really all on you. There's not that huge big difference. So him trying to dunk on Alabama because their education is ridiculous, or any school, I think it's absolutely absurd, because you went there to play football, you went there to get drafted, and you probably got paid, because every major D1 program is paying players even before NIL, including Alabama, including Georgia, Ohio State. You probably got paid, and you saw an opportunity to start day one, and you saw it as a shortcut to the NFL. So you don't have to put down. I hate the academic snobbery as it relates to athletics. If you're Stanford or Northwestern, you can be a snob because your teams are artificially less good because you can't offer all these other players. Otherwise, you need to shut up and just play football, get your degree, and move on. That's the end of my rant.
Well, yeah, I'll piggyback because Uncle Rico just put in a super chat that Michigan fans are notorious for that. that they think they're an Ivy League school and that's why they can't compete. Look, it in the free transfer world, it will start to matter a little bit because it does affect your ability to take transfers. These academic schools or high academic schools do have a lot more restrictions that apply to transfer students and admission of transfer students. It is going to quietly hurt them. But here's my big deal. Who would you say was the best defensive player for Georgia last year? I think we probably have the same answer. I think it's Nakobe Dean. What was Nakobe Dean's major?
He was an engineer, right?
He's an engineering major.
Yeah.
So you can talk about, they miss on some guys here and there, but the best players are usually not stupid, frankly. And there's some guys that are absolute freaks that do sort of skate by or can make big splashes for the team. But the best players in football are not dumb, because you can't be dumb and be a monster linebacker. Like, you have to have the ability to read coverage, and like, all the best Alabama linebackers are the same way, right? They always talk about they were Sabins on the field. Like, Rolando McClain, for all his issues, supposed to be highly intelligent. Like, CJ Mosley was a really intelligent guy. Even like probably the least talented for several years was Sean Dion Hamilton, right? Who ended up here. Ended up at the Redskins. And if I remember right, he was his high school valedictorian. There's a correlation there. And all these schools want to recruit intelligent, smart players because they're better players, because they're higher character guys. And so if you're talking about making the playoff, I think you'd be surprised how few stupid players are actually being offered by Alabama and Georgia, because they don't really want them. And they don't want to take risks on guys that have a lot of problems. They take a couple flyers, but not that many, really. And you can't build a great program out of it. So as an excuse for why you can't be competitive with Alabama or Ohio State, I just don't buy it. You can totally build a competitive program out of guys like Nakobe Dean. There are enough of them out there. The truth is, you can't recruit the high character, high talent guys away from Ohio State and Alabama. And so you're kind of left with that next tier. And a lot of those guys do have admissions issues. And then it becomes a problem. But at that point, we're already kind of in, overcomable, excusable problems. And I think that overcomes the astigmatism that's applied to those players.
You finally made it funny. And yeah, Alabama's APR, by the way. So in terms of how they handle academics as it relates to athletics, they're 6th in the nation. Oregon is 66th. I bristle at this too, because like I'm a Southern guy, I'm an SEC guy, and there's this stigmatism. There's a stigma about colleges in the South, and a lot of like Notre Dame. I remember when Alabama beat Brian Kelly a while back, he complained about their playing with one arm behind their back. In reality, Notre Dame recruits really well, and their results are commensurate with that. I hate when people of whatever big state school in whatever part of the country that is ranked better than Georgia, Florida, all of those are pretty good schools, talk about how, well, we've got our academics and you've got your athletics, when you offered all the same people that Georgia or Tennessee offered. And again, to my point, nobody is going to, this is just a life lesson for y'all. If there's anybody that's 18 years old looking to go to college, I look at resumes every single day. And Josh, you can back me up on this because you're a big shot lawyer at a big shot firm in a big shot city. I look at resumes every day. If you went to Clemson or Washington or Ohio State or Alabama or Texas or Georgia, I don't care. What is all the other stuff on your resume and how you are when I talk to you and interview you far outweighs anything else about which one of those schools you went to. How about you?
If we're talking undergraduate degrees, which is what we're really talking about right now, nobody really cares that much. I mean, if you go to an Ivy League, it does carry weight, but only so much. But if you're not
first and second job, it carries weight.
Yeah, it does. But if you're outside that, if you're like Oregon versus Florida, I've never heard anyone say, well, he only went to Florida or he only went to Georgia for undergrad. Like that's just not a, it's not a thing. And for these football players and everything else involved, I will say the thing I would say to most people is your degree field at a state school can easily trump a different degree field at a much more prestigious school, because
That's true.
there is no doubt that degree fields get looked at radically differently, and everybody knows that matters. So it's yeah. Now, like it's just like the football thing, right? Like you get evaluated in different conferences. When you start getting into grad school, very different discussion, and where you go to grad schools. But that's largely because, like in my world, where you go to law school, here's your life lesson. If you're going to go to law school somewhere, there's like 250 accredited law schools. About half of the ones on that list are going to get your resume, unfortunately, thrown in the trash at a lot of firms. Not saying you can't
True.
get a job, but it's radically different. But that's because there's a lot that goes into getting in law school. There's a lot that goes into passing the bar, a lot of other things. And it's very much tiered, and you kind of go to the best school you can get into. But that's law school, and that's a different thing, and that's grad school. In undergrad, nobody cares. So this whole idea that you went to Oregon and not Alabama for undergrad,
Well, and here's the thing,
I don't buy
Josh.
it, man.
Like,
It
I,
does. I'm telling you, the real world, the very academic world, nobody cares.
I would have had a lot more respect for him if he said, you know what? I didn't go to Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State because I saw that I could be a starter day one at Oregon. I knew I was a 3-and-done player. I believed in myself enough that I knew I was good enough to be in the NFL. And this gave me the chance to get the most eyeballs on me for the most amount of time over 3 years to make the most amount of money, get the highest draft pick in the NFL. I would respect that. Like, be honest, man. Like, because that's what it is. That's why you went there. You went there for whatever they paid you. Because again, and I'm not saying this is an indictment on Oregon. Every D1 college pre-NIL paid people under the table. Every single one. This is not a shot at Oregon. Phil Knight money was going somewhere. He went there because of whatever they paid him and the fact that he would be on the field the day one when he got there. And that was his quickest path and best path to a top 10 draft pick. And I respect that. Go get your money. I respect that. You don't have to trash other people in the process. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So, Josh, let's get, I don't have too much time left in the bag here. I got to pick up new puppy duty here in a second, but, give me your favorite from 2021, favorite surprise team that was good, that summer of 2021 you would have not said was going to be good at all, that really surprised you, and not because they had an advantageous schedule situation, but because they were an actual good team. Give me that one for you.
All right, let me take one aside here. Joseph L had a couple super chats. I want to touch on them before they get cold. One, he said Georgia had the fastest blitzers I've ever seen. We almost dropped that one. And one I acknowledge, yeah, like the team. There was one play in the championship game where Bryce Young was scrambling. I think it was a 2-point conversion, and he got run down by a linebacker. And I'm not sure how many people realized how exceptional it was, because Bryce Young's fast.
Right.
Not many linebackers can run him down, and they did it with ease. That was right after they had a lot of highlights right after Nakobe Dean had yelled at him for giving up coverage. And he also noted, is like he said, my sister went to Georgetown Law and got a big firm job, and he's like, undergrads don't matter, and that's absolutely true. If you go to law school, don't go to law school unless you can go to a really good law school. Doesn't matter what your dream is. It's going to be probably a financial boondoggle if to go to a lower law school and think you'll work your way up.
Josh, isn't it like this? Like if you want a top tier firm, you got to go top 30 school, top 10% of your class.
Generally, yeah. If you want to go to a top tier, and you can go to a top 30 school and not go to a top tier firm, but go to a medium sized firm and have a solid shot. But if you're not if you want a real like law job and be a real time, big time lawyer, and you don't go to a top 30 school, you should know the odds are very much stacked against you, because there are 40,000 law grads a year. And there are not 40,000 law slots, and not a tenth of that. Anyway, side point. Team that surprised me in 2022. I think
21.
there can be 21. Sorry, I've been shoveling snow all day, so I'm a little incoherent myself. Yeah, it's been a fun day. I think there's only one answer, and it's Arkansas. Like, I did not see Arkansas being what they were because they were a legitimately good football team.
You
And
picked
you
them
can
to
talk.
cover against Texas, though.
I
I did
did pick
not.
them to cover against Texas. There were reasons for that. I thought they'd be solid and they'd have matchups. I didn't think they'd destroy Texas. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like the
Yeah.
level of play they showed was shocking. And I mean, Pittman is turning that thing around fast, and they are taking a ton of transfers. They got Hazelwood from Oklahoma, who
Drew
was a
Sanders.
former 5-star receiver. They got Drew Sanders, who was a top 15, top 16 outside linebacker. The only reason he's not starting at Alabama is they have 2 other 5-stars at outside linebacker. Like straight up, he wasn't a bust. He's just behind, he's behind Will Anderson and another top 10 5-star.
He was the first
Or
guy on the field after Allen went down.
yeah, like he's phenomenal, and he's going to be there. He's going to be one of the top 5 outside linebackers in the SEC next year. Arkansas is turning things around in a big way. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I would tell you my 1B, if it's more interesting, might be Michigan State. I thought what they did under Mel Tucker this year was really surprising. But my number 1 answer would be Arkansas.
Mine was probably Michigan. Michigan was, I thought, trending in a pretty bad direction. And look, they got handled by Georgia. They're not quite there. But what they did against Ohio State was significant. And what they did throughout the year was significant. I think the most significant maybe was the Iowa game. The Big Ten championship game was huge because it wasn't even close. From the jump, it wasn't close. So I thought that was Harbaugh's best job. I thought they did really good. Somebody said Baylor, but we both said Aranda would have that thing humming soon. They would be playing way above where they were when he inherited it pretty quickly. And Baylor's been decent and mostly derailed by, off the field stuff more than anything. So from that standpoint, Baylor didn't super surprise me. Lamar Stevens, real quick, because there's a side chat discussion about Joe Burrow and LSU because the Bengals won. He said Joe Burrow would have eaten this Georgia team alive as long as he had his all-pro wide receivers with him. Josh, I think 2019 LSU, especially because of matchups, because they had pretty decent pass rush. They didn't have an elite defense. They had a good defense that clicked by the end of the year. They had a good pass rush, played well in space defensively, good corners, so their wide receivers aren't getting open against 2021 Georgia, but they are uniquely equipped to really exploit Georgia's defense. And I will say not only from the wide receiver position, but also throwing to the running back out of the backfield. I think that 2019 LSU, I think 2021 Georgia would have beaten a lot of previous champions, but 2019 LSU was uniquely, from a matchup standpoint, a team that would beat them pretty comfortably.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. That 2019 LSU team was I'm not even saying not a great. They were not a good defense until the last 4 games of the year. And it's still weird when you look at how many they had a lot of high level draft picks on that squad, like Queen and a lot of other guys that came on really late. But offensively, I still don't think we really appreciate how good that 2019 Alabama LSU game was on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, it's just insane. Like Burrow, Chase, Jefferson, Edwards-Helaire on one side. And the other side, you had 2 first-round draft pick tackles, Najee Harris, 4 first-round draft pick receivers, and a first-round draft pick quarterback on the other side of the ball. I think both of those teams would have been nightmare matchups for Georgia defensively. Georgia, I've been hesitant to say this because I think it'd be taken too strong, but Georgia did catch a good bit of a break that they didn't. This is the one year they didn't have to face a truly high-level functional elite passing offense in the playoff. And I know Ohio State fans would say they were in there. And I think Ohio State's really good offensively this past year, but they weren't 2019. They weren't 2019 LSU. I don't know that they're 2018 Bama or Clemson even. I think they're more like 2017 Bama with Tua, kind of. That's about where Ohio State was. That's not a dig. That was
Didn't
a national
Georgia and
title
Michigan
team.
both benefit from all of the kind of falling back to defensive football in 2021. Like both of those teams, and to Georgia's credit, like this championship has no asterisk next to it. I'm not saying that. Don't quote me on that wrongly. Michigan and Georgia both were perfectly equipped in terms of timing for this season.
Yeah, I think they were. This was a 1 year, I think, where you could play ball control offense and not get punked by somebody in the playoff. And before people, hopefully, and I think this is the best thing about the way the season turned out, that people shouldn't be offended by it, because Georgia got punked by somebody doing that in the SEC championship game, right?
Correct.
They played a high level offense that was hot, and they got burned bad because, as we said, you can't stop one of those offenses from scoring 40 points. If they have first round draft pick talent at receiver and quarterback, and they're hot, they're gonna score 40. And Georgia and Michigan were not equipped to play a game where they had to score 40 points against a good team. But if they were going to be in a game that was going to be a game in the 20s or 30s, they were old school throwback elite at those kind of games. And, I will say in Michigan's defense, we've been kind of, they lost that game, but what did I say in the Michigan preview? I had them getting blown out, but I said they're not that much worse than a lot of other teams. Georgia was kind of a nightmare matchup for Michigan. Mm-hmm. But I also noted the fact that, like in the SEC championship game, I actually think Michigan would have still stood a pretty darn solid chance of beating Alabama. Not saying I would have picked them to win more often than not. I think they would have given Alabama a really, really tough game. And if without Williams, I might pick them to win, because with their pass rush and defense being what it was and run game, it would have been good. And I think they're going to be kind of forgotten.
For me, against any SEC team that makes the playoffs, Alabama or Georgia this year, both of those teams had obscene run defenses. And yeah, Georgia cracked off a 60-something yard run late, but Alabama's run defense was elite plus this year. Georgia's run defense was elite plus this year, which really changes what a team like Michigan does. And that's why Ohio State probably was better equipped to play either one of those two teams. The problem is, I think that Alabama, even though struggling most of the year running the ball, would run for 250 on Ohio State. I think Georgia would run for 300 on Ohio State. And that's the problem when you talk about, like, a lot of Ohio State fans want to say we should have been in the playoffs. We would have been a better matchup for these two teams. They only see the thing that they're good at, which is offense. And I think more than like late touchdown. Michigan had a late touchdown, but really they only scored like 6 or 10 points or whatever. Yeah, I think Ohio State scores in the 20s against Georgia. I think Georgia could have scored 50 against Ohio State this year.
Everything Utah did to make that a 48-45 game, Georgia is, and I mean like in a literal sense, they are literally twice as good as Utah on the offensive side of the ball. We talked all year, right? They were the third best team points per drive in the country, but they ran a slow tempo, so the scores were lower and people didn't appreciate it because they just played fewer possessions. But points per drive, they were third in the country. And Ohio State, I'm with you, Ohio State wouldn't have slowed them down. We did flag the fact that Michigan really wasn't a great run defense, but they were a really, really awesome pass defense. And my biggest concern, which we'll never have the answer to completely right, but it was that Michigan just looked a little outclassed from a size talent perspective in that Georgia game. Less than Cincinnati did. But yeah.
Josh, let me give you one more question, because I think this is interesting too. And it gives you a chance to be in your natural habitat and go negative. Who, on the flip side, who did you think coming into the year would be really good that turned out to be really, really bad or really underperform to your standard? A lot of people in the comments are going to say Texas, because we've been high on Texas, but Texas was like a team that was decent, that won a lot of one-score games, and their record was bad, but I don't think they were a bad team. Maybe it is Texas for you, but give me who you think really disappointed you based on your summer August expectation.
Well, I was going to say Texas. I mean, your point stands, right? They lost to the 3 top teams in the Big 12, all by 1 score each. And I saw Parker at Stats of War put this, I think it was him that put this chart together of like time most time spent leading a game in the Big 12 was like, it was a bar chart of like leading versus trailing.
Yeah.
And Texas, I can't remember. I think they may have been first in the Big 12. It's like they spent more of the season leading games than any other team in the Big 12, and they lost 7 games. And that kind of exemplifies their season. But this is also your point, right? That their season was a massive disappointment. But from a quality perspective, they actually weren't as bad as a lot of people think or believe they are. They were really competitive in those losses. They just found a way to lose a lot of winnable games. I will say,
2007 Alabama, right? Nobody wanted to play them, even though they went like 7-6. That
right.
was still a tough out.
And the reason you're saying that, and I think both of us think the same thing, as much as people don't ever want to hear Texas is back, this is the kind of season that rings alarm bells that they may take a big step forward next year.
Right.
Teams that have seasons where they lose a lot of winnable games and are usually teams that are plugging holes still, refilling their roster, etc. Let me flip to the other one, which probably ought to be the first one on our list, but it happened so early that we all kind of disregarded it. Clemson. Clemson had a great defense. They were not a great team. And it's not just like they lost a few games that they shouldn't have lost. They had a really weak schedule. They were as much lucky to have their record as they were unlucky to have their record. And that offense was bad.
Yeah.
Like legit bad. Not just not up to their standards. It was, how does an offense with the talent you have ever end up this bad? And I'm still trying to, we talked about it earlier with all the problems they have. We talked about it all year, but I'm still trying to process how, like, if you've got 5-star receivers and a 5-star quarterback and a 5-star running back, you'd think in the RPO world you could find some way to be productive, and they just couldn't do it. And they still have that transfer, their Dabo's policy that he's not going to take transfers like everybody else. It really feels like they're putting themselves behind the 8 ball, and they've lost Venables, and they are in serious danger of taking a massive step back from a national perspective.
Well, I said after the 2020 season that I was not a Tony Elliott fan. I thought he was he didn't adjust well. I felt like that whatever was going on in college football at the time was had him flummoxed as a coordinator, and I was not excited in that regard. Leading into the 21 season, he way more underperformed than I expected. If you look, so Clemson is one of those teams who's been a stalwart in the playoffs that has not really recruited like a Georgia, who hasn't been in the playoffs that much, like an A&M. Like they're like top 10-ish, right? But they're not elite. And there's a huge gap between the number 1, number 2 team and the number 5 team, much less the 9 or 10th team. So they didn't have a ton of talent, but relative to the ACC, they shouldn't be doing goal line stands against Georgia Tech to win that game, right? Like that's the problem that I had. And like you said, they had a lot of luck to have the record they did. Josh, I will see your Clemson and raise you Florida.
Huh.
And that's all I'm going to say and let you respond.
Well, first, I was skeptical of Florida from the jump, if you remember. I just didn't think, with the recruiting that they'd had, I didn't think they were going to replace the guys that they lost. Pitts and Kadarius Toney were phenomenal receivers. They had a guy in Trask that way outplayed his recruiting ranking. That team was better than they were expected to be. Like, Pitts was not a 5-star receiver. Trask was not a 5-star quarterback. They were frankly lucky that they hit on guys they hit to be as good as they were. But the recruiting level that was under McElwain was really poor. And then Mullen was there for several years. And I was always, my thing at Mississippi State is that he was a good X's and O's coach. And his whole program was built around taking Mississippi boys that wanted to stay home at Mississippi. And they got a lot of D-line talent, and they've got enough good, but not Alabama level athletes that they could form a good team out of. And he would go 8-4. And he'd lose to the teams he was supposed to lose to, maybe bite one in a game where they were hot. And then they were consistently like 12th in the conference in recruiting. And that just was never going to cut it at Florida. So I wasn't shocked. But to be as bad as they were, yeah. I
Well, they
mean,
give it like 52 to Samford. Like that, they had
yeah,
given up at that point, so they were better early in the year than that, and that is something that a lot of people have given us flack for because we were like, you know, we had Florida at some point in our top 10 because of how they played Alabama. They were not a terrible team. Like they
they
beat
beat
South
they beat
Florida way worse than Cincinnati did.
they
Way
beat Tennessee
worse.
they beat Tennessee 38-14 in week 4.
Right. Right.
Like when and that was right when Tennessee was starting to figure things out, and then they lose 20-13 to Kentucky, which I think people at the end of the year finally realized why we kept flirting with Kentucky around our top 10. They were a really good team.
Mm-hmm.
And stomp Vandy, and then the turning point was that really the loss to LSU, the 49-42 game to LSU, where a legitimately bad LSU offense ran it down their throat
Yep.
over and over again, just ran them over. And the next week they lose 34-7 to Georgia, and it was clear after those back-to-back games, it was like LSU dispirited them. They were at
Yep.
3 losses, which means they were out of the conference title hunt. They got blown out and beat up by Georgia. They tried the Anthony Richardson experiment at quarterback, which I had been saying to that point and making every Florida fan under the sun mad
Yeah.
that everything I had seen from him in games prior was that he has phenomenal tools. He has every opportunity to be a great quarterback. He is absolutely not ready to start at quarterback because he just,
Nope.
there's things you have to do to run an offense and he doesn't know how to do them. And you saw all the negative plays that created in bunches, right? I saw a lot of decision making in those blowouts, whereas like that decision that was a touchdown absolutely will be a pick six against a better team. And you saw that. And then after that, it's like, next week was 40-17 against South Carolina. That the way they finished the season was miserable. And I will say another team you can say the same thing about probably was Missouri, right? Like a lot of teams, there was this, we were never high on Missouri, so it's not the same feeling for us, but there was this thing out there for a lot of people that Missouri was this like sleeper team. And like, they lost early to Kentucky 35-28, but that was respectable. But then they lost to overtime to Boston College, and they lost 62-24 to Tennessee. And through the remainder of the year, I mean, they lost by 20, like at least 17 points in like 3 more SEC games. I mean, they were horrid. Lost to
Yeah.
Army in the bowl. They were bad.
And that's why, like, a lot of people are like, haha, SEC, whatever their bowl record was. But, like, SEC got 13 teams in bowls, which means, like, the next highest was 9. The next highest conference was 9, which means you're reaching way down to play. Auburn played an 11-win Houston team, barely lost, without Bo Nix, without their best corner, without 5 defensive starters in the field. Like, and I'm not going to make this an SEC thing, but like Missouri was bad. Like we weren't excited about like them at all throughout the year. And then they lost to Army, like because they were a bad football team. Alex Compton said something that I want to touch on real quick because he said basically at least this season got us to Billy Napier, who's made some moves in the offseason. And I agree. Like we said, I think 3 years ago that somebody needed to hire Billy Napier. And I think that he has done actually better in the moves that he's made from a staff standpoint. And I think looking at the transfer portal standpoint at Florida already, that at least gives me confidence if I'm a Florida fan that they're on the right track. Tell me what you think so far about what you've seen from Napier. I know it's early, but what you've seen from him.
Yeah, every sign from him is that he knows what he's doing. Everything I've heard from people. Look, I'm not a beat writer. We try to stick to our guns and previews and stuff because we don't hear things like our buddy Pate does. But from people that know better, everything we've heard is that he's really changed the way the program's run. I don't mean just change the culture. I mean like built a program, like hired analysts. Josh Pate's show was on right before ours, and he spent a while talking about how he's expanded the budget to actually fill out the room. So they have this sort of analyst that all the, like Georgia and Alabama have. He hired a lot of assistant coaches from big name programs, from connections he's made from those programs, overhauled nutrition, overhauled where the Like even where the dorms were staying for Florida players, they were all mad about. It's all stuff Josh Pate was just talking about in his video. And again, he gave us a plug, and I'm trying to give him a plug back, right? But the guy knows his stuff, and I trust him when he says these things. That's the stuff that encourages me. But the biggest thing is really like fundamental football at Florida has been falling off. And the big thing with Napier and what he's building is I think he's also building a recruiting pool that's going to be finally competitive at a high level, going to start to draw more of that recruiting talent back at Florida. I know Florida State made some inroads. Norvell, for all his faults, seems like he's turning it around on the recruiting trail. The one thing I will say with Florida, and you tell me if you disagree, that team actually did have a lot of, like, they had like 3 seniors on the defensive line. It was like 4 or 5, I think like 5 or 6 seniors on defense. A lot of experienced players on offense, particularly offensive line. Had 3 seniors, grad transfers. You get 2 starting running backs or seniors. I'm looking at their depth chart right now. And it wasn't a very talented roster, which is why I didn't have a lot of expectations for him. He's going to have to make a lot of inroads in the transfer portal, I think, to have immediate success. And if you're a Florida fan, I think you need to be realistic that your problems weren't X's and O's. You had a good X's and O's coach. Your problem was program and roster. Napier can't fix that in 6 months. You got to get – I am not a super patience preaching person. You've heard this a million times. These coaches make $7 million a year. You got to produce. But you also have to realize what they're producing. And for Napier, his job is to produce a better program, produce better recruiting results. I want to see recruiting results next year. I don't want to see a 10-win season. Like, that's not what my barometer is.
That's a good point.
And you need to be patient with that.
Florida needs a quarterback. And I think that, if we're talking about coaches who built a program and didn't immediately look at like what Lincoln Riley is doing is taking a bunch of skill players to USC, but we don't know what he's building from a ground up program standpoint. Maybe he can build that. Maybe he just inherited a good one at Oklahoma. We'll see. I like what Napier's doing, and I like what Shane Beamer is doing at South Carolina. And I think these are 2 in the SEC East that, if they're, like you said, if the fan bases will be patient, then that gives them time to build foundationally things like the nutrition program, things like the minutia, like you said, about dorms and stuff like that stuff. If you don't have the patience from the fans and from administration, you can't do it. Which, if you can do those things, then you can start to get some momentum in recruiting and in some wins and things like that. But you got to have the buy-in up front. And I think that Florida fans now have seen cycling coaches here for a while. It's harder for Florida fans to be patient than South Carolina fans. But if they can take a step back and say, like you said, I think that's the best thing you've said all night. I don't necessarily care about this season as much as I do the roster and the foundation laying. If they can be patient for a couple of years with that, then I think Florida's in a really good spot.
Yeah, the Florida, where they're at right now, is in the same boat that USC's in, that Clemson's been in. They don't have when you don't have top 5 recruiting classes, even top 10 recruiting classes on a consistent basis, you need guys to hit. And Clemson's formula for success was built around getting a bunch of guys that were number 1 at their position. And you can be extremely successful in the sport of college football if you've got a first-round draft pick, 2 first-round draft pick receivers, first-round draft pick quarterback and running back, and then you have low round, 6th, 7th round guys that are all seniors to build an offensive line around and just sort of have role players around them. That's what Clemson's done. Impact first round draft pick guys and guys around them. The problem with that approach is that first round draft picks still are 5-star recruits rather still bust at about a 50% clip. And that was the Ole Miss story years ago. I've always said this snippet that when Hugh Freeze was at Ole Miss, he had Laquan Treadwell, he had Kemdichi, and he had trying to remember, he had 3 number 1 of their position players.
It was a safety, right?
No, that was a 4th one. That was Connor. I'm just drawing a total blank. It wasn't the quarterback, was it? No, but he had 3 5-star recruits. They were the number 1 at their position. And it was the first time in 10 years when I looked it up that all 3 of them went in the first round. The number 1 player at these 3 spots all were first round draft picks. It was the only time in like 10 years that had happened. If you play that game, you will get burned at a good clip. Your DJ Uyungaleles are like 50-50 shots. And even, Clemson's had a 5-star guy named Hunter Johnson that was that's at Northwestern and has been really bad at Northwestern. But we forgot about him because they got Trevor Lawrence in after Kelly Bryant,
Laramie
and
Tunsil.
Lawrence replaced Laramie
Thank you,
Tunsil.
Lamar.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lamar.
Yep. Laramie Tunsil. Thanks, Lamar. That's it. It was left tackle, DT, and wide receiver. For number one recruit, 3 positions, all were 5 stars. I just couldn't remember. Gas mask at the draft, notwithstanding, still went first round. But that was Clemson's problem. I don't know what USC is going to be like because we're talking about their issue was offensive and defensive line, right? It wasn't really skill position talent. How much can Lincoln Riley fix that? How much of that was the coaching staff? I don't know. I mean, that's mostly recruiting. But Florida last year was the same way. It was a lot of 3-star guys. You got guys like Moon and Miller that kind of got senior and got good, but they weren't really high round draft pick sort of players. And you had a couple superstar first round draft pick receivers and a high round quarterback that popped for you. That is not sustainable for success. And if you want to be what you want to be, you have to have deep high level recruiting classes, because there are a lot of guys that are not going to pan out. It happens at Alabama, it happens at Georgia, it happens at Ohio State. They've got a lot of 5 stars that don't pan out. And a lot of them, a lot of them transfer these days. And you have to sustain that in order to be able to consistently have a good enough roster to compete the way Florida wants to compete. And it'll be interesting to see if Florida gets there and they can turn it around. It'll be interesting to see how USC and Clemson can maintain success with not having that approach. But that's my rant on it, but I think it's also applicable to all those schools and what all of them want to accomplish.
All right, I got to go to bed soon, and I know you do too, but I want you to, this is kind of our chance to give a little bit of a parting shot for 2021 into 22. I don't know how much, content we're going to do in the off season, but just kind of what you hope to see out of 22 that you didn't see maybe in 21. For the football season. What are you looking forward to?
The biggest thing that I'm looking forward to in 22, probably for the big out of conference games to matter at the end of the year.
Yeah.
We thought we had this awesome out of conference slate going into 2021. And so many of those games that we thought were going to be massive swing games, Indiana, Cincinnati was high on that list, ended up not being necessarily the best teams at the end of the year. You can even throw Oregon. I would say Oregon, Ohio State, as painful as it is to hear, probably falls on that list, right? If Ohio State beat Michigan, we have a different discussion. But Ohio State wasn't the team that would beat Michigan. Oregon didn't win the Pac-12. And we thought that was a huge tilt, and it didn't end up being that significant. And a lot of others didn't as well. So Auburn, Penn State was a huge one, right? That was a big tilt early. We took a lot of flack for them. I kept not putting them in my top 10 at the time. I think I ended up being proven not a hater, but just being somewhat right about what those teams were. I'll be excited if our out of conference games end up being really high level teams, and we end up talking about those late in the year, and we end up being able to use them as a barometer, because it's so important for us in our top 10 rankings and whatnot to use those as an evaluation. So that's maybe my maybe where I'm at that.
There's a bunch of people asking about Rattler. I said he's a huge upgrade over what South Carolina had, and somebody said, man, College Football Nerd still loves Rattler. Look, I don't know, I saw a lot of South Carolina football this year, so I am equipped to say this. I guarantee you, whomever said that, and I don't see where it is now, but whomever said that about us, they hadn't seen a lot of South Carolina football to know how big of an upgrade that is at quarterback, even if he's not elite or whatever. So just want to wrap it up for y'all. We will do some off-season content. It won't be a lot. We won't be consistent like we have been throughout the year. We will be consistent come this summer when we start to do previews, but we got some interesting stuff, and we're going to try to bring in some friends, maybe some RJ Young, maybe some Josh Pate, friends of the program, and keep things going. We don't want to go radio silent in the off season. So thanks so much, y'all, for sticking with us all year. This was a lot of fun. We love it, each and every one of y'all. Have a great off season. I know it's going to suck because you don't have that football, but maybe spring games will keep you going. Love y'all. God bless.